A crisp, wintry breeze swept through the streets of New York City, carrying with it the faint hum of holiday cheer. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. It was late December, the time of year when the city's frenetic energy softened just enough to reveal moments of unexpected kindness. The avenue was alive with a mix of festivity and purpose. Shoppers clutching oversized bags, street vendors hawking roasted chestnuts, and bundled-up children peeking eagerly at glittering department store displays. Among the glowing lights and bustling crowds, a sense of quiet anticipation lingered, almost imperceptible, like a held breath before a revelation. On the Upper East Side, where luxury was woven into the fabric of life, a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of a modest yet charming brownstone. The vehicle's tinted windows reflected the warm glow of string lights adorning the surrounding trees, obscuring the figure seated inside. As the engine cut off, the door opened, and out stepped a tall, composed young man whose presence was both unassuming and magnetic. Barron Trump adjusted the collar of his tailored navy coat, his blonde hair catching the last rays of daylight. At 19, his frame towered above most, yet his demeanor carried a quiet humility that often left people momentarily puzzled. He wasn't here to be recognized, nor did he expect to stand out. This was a part of the city where influence and wealth were ubiquitous, and anonymity was a luxury few truly appreciated. Barron cherished it. He glanced at the small plaque by the brownstone's entrance, Hope Haven Shelter for Children and Families. The lettering was simple, understated, much like the building itself. To anyone passing by, it might have seemed like just another nonprofit lost in the sprawling maze of Manhattan's charitable organizations. But Barron had done his research. Behind those doors were people working tirelessly to provide food, warmth, and care for families displaced by life's unrelenting storms. It wasn't a glossy operation designed to attract headlines. It was personal, intimate, and profoundly impactful. Taking a breath, Barron stepped forward, his polished leather shoes crunching softly against the light dusting of snow on the pavement. He carried no entourage, no media presence, and no formalities. For the youngest member of one of the most famous families in the world, this was an intentional choice. He'd been raised in the glaring spotlight of public life, but tonight, he wanted to be just another person walking through those doors. Inside, the shelter buzzed with quiet activity. Volunteers moved with practiced efficiency, setting up tables for dinner service and stacking boxes of donated goods along the walls. The air smelled faintly of baked bread and spiced cider, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the modest Christmas tree tucked into a corner. Children's laughter echoed faintly from an adjacent room, a welcome reminder that even in hardship, joy could find a way to bloom. Barron paused in the entryway, taking in the scene. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, not with the aloof detachment of someone accustomed to privilege, but with genuine curiosity. He was here to listen, to observe, and if he could, to contribute in a way that mattered. A volunteer approached him, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and a clipboard clutched to her chest. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but slightly wary. It wasn't unusual for strangers to wander in, especially during the holiday season. But the young man before her seemed out of place in his finely tailored coat and air of quiet confidence. Barron offered a small, disarming smile. "I'm here to see Ms. Carmichael. I spoke with her earlier this week." The woman's expression softened. "Oh, of course. She's just in the back. Let me take you to her." She gestured for him to follow, leading him through the bustling main room and into a quieter office space at the back of the building. As they walked, Barron caught glimpses of the shelter's inhabitants. A young mother helping her toddler color at a table, an elderly man dozing in a chair by the radiator, a group of teens huddled over a board game. Each face told a story, and Barron felt a pang of determination swell in his chest. These weren't just statistics in a report or distant faces in a news segment. They were people, each navigating struggles he could scarcely imagine. The volunteer knocked lightly on a door marked Director before pushing it open. Inside, a woman in her early 50s looked up from a desk cluttered with paperwork and the occasional framed photo. Her graying hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her warm, tired eyes lit up when she saw Barron step inside. "Mr. Trump," she greeted, rising to shake his hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Please, call me Barron, he replied, his voice steady but warm. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. Miss Carmichael gestured for him to sit, her curiosity evident but restrained. She'd been skeptical when she'd first received his call. A Trump, reaching out to her humble organization? It sounded like a publicity stunt. But his voice had been earnest, his questions thoughtful, and now, seeing him in person, she felt her skepticism begin to fade. I'll admit, she began, leaning forward slightly, I was surprised to hear from you. We don't usually attract much attention from, well, someone in your position. Barron nodded, his expression serious. I understand, but this isn't about attention. I've been looking into smaller organizations making a real difference, ones that might not have the resources or visibility they deserve. What you're doing here, helping families rebuild their lives, it's exactly the kind of work I want to support. Ms. Carmichael studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. She found none. Instead, she saw a young man with an earnest determination that reminded her of why she'd started this shelter in the first place. Well, she said, a faint smile playing at her lips, I hope you don't mind getting your hands a little dirty. We can always use another pair of willing hands around here. Barron's smile widened. That's exactly why I'm here. As the two began discussing the shelter's work, its challenges, and its hopes for the future, a subtle tension lingered beneath the surface. Miss Carmichael couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to Barron's visit than he was letting on. Over the next few days, Barron's visits to the shelter became routine. Each evening, after his obligations elsewhere, meetings with advisors, family gatherings, and discreet business dealings, he would slip away, donning his coat and slipping out of the limelight, making his way to the brownstone. It was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the life he'd known, one that teetered between public expectations and the quiet solitude he craved. Here, no one cared about his last name or who he was related to. They simply appreciated his presence, the genuine interest he showed in their stories, and the way he listened, truly listened. Miss Carmichael, meanwhile, began to soften, her wariness giving way to a quiet admiration. She saw Barron's commitment to the shelter's cause, even if he hadn't yet made any promises. He had quietly requested lists of the most immediate needs, the shelter's infrastructure, additional food provisions, toys for the children, and, though she didn't yet understand his motivations, she was impressed by his thoroughness. But even as he grew closer to the shelter's inner workings, something was nagging at her, an unease that she couldn't quite shake. Barron was too composed, too measured in his every action. Was it all too good to be true? Was there something he wasn't saying? It was a Thursday evening when Barron finally decided to reveal his intentions. After another quiet dinner service, when the last of the volunteers had gone home, he asked Miss Carmichael to meet him in the back office. The shelter was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wood floors. The children had gone to bed, and the volunteers had cleaned up, leaving the building in a peaceful calm. I've been thinking a lot about how I can help, Barron began, standing by the window, staring out into the darkening street. You've been kind enough to let me shadow you for the past few days. Now, I want to contribute in a way that makes a real difference. Miss Carmichael, sitting across from him, raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? He turned, his face serious, his gaze steady. I want to donate $1 million to Hope Haven. The words hung in the air, both an offer and a challenge. Ms. Carmichael blinked, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was saying. $1 million. It was more money than the shelter had ever seen in its entire existence, more than she'd ever thought possible. Barron, I don't, she started, but he cut her off. Think about it. The shelter could expand its programs. You could help more families. You could bring in specialists, offer after-school programs, give the kids a real shot at a future. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of something else there, something pressing. He was not simply offering a gift. He was putting the weight of his gesture into her hands, daring her to accept. But for Miss Carmichael, there was an instinctive hesitation. It wasn't about the money. It was about the why. What did Barron want in return? And why this particular shelter? Was he trying to cleanse his conscience? Or was there something deeper at play? She leaned forward, her fingers curling around the edge of her chair. "I'm grateful, Barron. Truly. But a donation of this size? It would change everything," he finished for her. "I know, but I'm not asking for anything in return. This is about making a difference. You're doing great work here, and I want to help." Her eyes searched his face, trying to read him. Barron's expression remained impassive, though there was an underlying intensity in the way he spoke, something that hinted at a deeper turmoil. He was too careful with his words, too focused on the action of giving, and not on the reason behind it. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't yet put her finger on it. "I don't know what to say," Ms. Carmichael murmured. Barron stepped closer to the desk, placing a folder in front of her. Inside was a signed check, made out for the full amount. "Just say yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She stared at the check, the weight of the offer pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. A part of her wanted to refuse, to dismiss the gesture as some sort of high-profile PR stunt, but another part, something buried deep, was tempted. How could she say no? $1 million could keep the shelter running for years, could expand its reach, could change lives. How could she turn that down? But something tugged at her, a warning bell she couldn't ignore. This didn't feel like an act of pure altruism. It felt like a game, and Barron was the player in control. As much as she wanted to help the children and families who relied on Hope Haven, she feared that accepting this money might come at a price she couldn't yet understand. Meanwhile, across the city, Barron's family had begun to notice his increasing absences. His father, Donald Trump, had grown accustomed to having his children near, especially Barron, the youngest, whose reserved nature had always kept him somewhat removed from the chaotic world of politics and business that defined their family. Barron's decision to focus on philanthropy, away from the constant glare of public life, was surprising. Even more so was his refusal to make any public statements or to involve the media in his charitable endeavors. Donald, ever the pragmatist, didn't understand the appeal of hiding in the shadows. "You're wasting a golden opportunity," he would say during their brief phone conversations. "People want to see you out there, Barron. The whole world is watching. Why not use it to your advantage?" But Barron wasn't interested in the spotlight. The older he got, the more he resented the constant pressure to be something he wasn't. He didn't want to follow the family business or make headlines. He just wanted to make a difference, quietly, without fanfare. Still, the tension between Barron and his father continued to grow. Donald's increasing insistence on pushing Barron into the public sphere felt less like fatherly concern and more like an attempt to control him, to mold him into a version of himself. The weight of his father's expectations was suffocating, and Barron could feel it pressing down on him like an iron fist. Meanwhile, in the world outside the shelter, a reporter from one of the tabloids had caught wind of Barron's visits to Hope Haven. It was only a matter of time before the story broke. How the youngest Trump heir was secretly donating to a children's charity, staying out of the limelight, working behind the scenes. The media would eat it up, turn it into a sensational piece, a story of redemption and generosity. But Barron didn't want the attention. And yet, as his family pressed him to publicize his good deeds, as the media swirled ever closer to the truth, he realized that he couldn't control how the world would see him. Whether he liked it or not, his name and his actions would be magnified. The moment of reckoning came late one Friday evening when the donation check finally made its way into the hands of the shelter's board of directors. Ms. Carmichael had hesitated for days, unsure whether to accept the offer or pass on it. The money would change everything, but what price would they pay for that change? The board had no such qualms. It was too good an offer to turn down. As the board members gathered in the shelter's modest conference room to discuss their options, Barron's name floated like a cloud above their heads. They were all aware of who he was, of the weight of his last name, but they were also aware of what his donation meant. It was a turning point, an opportunity they couldn't afford to miss. Ms. Carmichael sat at the head of the table, her fingers clenched together in front of her, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. She had always prided herself on running the shelter with integrity, on making decisions that were grounded in the well-being of the children and families who relied on them. But now, as the board pushed her to accept Barron's offer, she found herself at a crossroads. Would she betray the very principles she had built Hope Haven on? But it was too late to turn back. The check was already in hand, and with it, the shelter's future, and her own, would never be the same. The night was colder than any before it, a biting wind whipping through the streets and carrying whispers of something ominous. Inside Hope Haven, however, the warmth of the holiday spirit remained. Volunteers bustled about, hanging garlands, arranging gifts, and preparing for the shelter's annual Christmas Eve dinner. A tradition Miss Carmichael had started years ago to bring a little light to those who needed it most. Yet, amidst the cheer, a strange tension permeated the air. It was the kind of tension that wasn't immediately apparent but slowly crept into one's awareness, leaving a trail of unease. Barron arrived just as the final preparations were wrapping up. His presence was met with a mixture of surprise and quiet relief. In the weeks since his first visit, he'd become something of a fixture at the shelter, his calm demeanor and willingness to help earning the respect of volunteers and residents alike. Tonight, however, there was a guardedness about him, a faraway look in his eyes that made even Ms. Carmichael pause. "You're just in time," she greeted him, attempting to shake off her concern. "We could use your help setting up the dining room." He nodded, offering a faint smile. "Of course. Anything you need." The hours passed quickly. The shelter's modest dining room soon transformed into a cozy haven of flickering candles, neatly set tables, and a modest tree adorned with handmade ornaments. Families trickled in, their faces lighting up at the sight of the feast laid out before them. Laughter and conversation filled the room, the earlier tension seemingly forgotten by everyone except Barron. Standing near the back of the room, he watched the scene unfold with an intensity that bordered on discomfort. His hands were stuffed into his coat pockets, his jaw tight. It was as though he were bracing for something, though he couldn't yet name what it was. Miss Carmichael noticed his unease and approached him, her expression concerned. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then glanced at her. "I need to talk to you. Privately." The urgency in his voice sent a ripple of anxiety through her, but she nodded, leading him to the small office in the back. Once inside, she closed the door and turned to face him. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone more serious now. Barron paced the room, his usual composure cracking at the edges. "There's something I didn't tell you," he began, his voice low but charged. "Something I didn't think would matter. But it does." Miss Carmichael's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He stopped pacing, turning to her with a look that was equal parts desperation and regret. "The donation. It's not clean." Her stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "It's money tied to my family," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "To deals, investments, things I don't fully understand. But it's not legitimate. Not in the way you think. I thought I could use it for good, to make something right, but now, I don't know." Miss Carmichael stared at him, the weight of his words crashing over her like a tidal wave. "You're telling me you gave this shelter dirty money?" "I didn't know it would turn into this," he said quickly, his voice rising. "I thought I could separate myself from it, that no one would find out, but someone's onto me. A reporter." Her breath caught. "A reporter?" Barron nodded, his face pale. "They've been digging. They know I've been coming here. If they connect the dots, if they publish the story, it's going to destroy this place." Miss Carmichael sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "You promised there were no strings attached, that this was about helping us." "It is," he said, stepping closer. "But I didn't anticipate this. I didn't think it would spiral out of control." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling between them. Outside, the faint hum of holiday cheer continued, oblivious to the storm brewing within these walls. Finally, Miss Carmichael broke the silence, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done? If this comes out, it won't just ruin your reputation. It will ruin everything we've built here. People will stop trusting us. The families who rely on this shelter." "I know," Barron interrupted, his voice breaking. "I know, and I'm trying to fix it. That's why I'm telling you now. We need to get ahead of this." Her eyes narrowed. "And how do you suggest we do that? Lie? Cover it up?" "No," he said firmly. "We tell the truth. We take control of the narrative before someone else does." She shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "You don't understand how this works. One bad headline, one scandal, and it's over. This shelter doesn't have the resources to weather something like that. Barron's fists clenched at his sides. Then let me take the fall. Let them come after me, not you. And what happens when they dig deeper? She snapped. When they start asking questions about where the money went, about why you chose us. His silence was answer enough. The knock on the door startled them both, breaking the tense standoff. A volunteer poked their head in, their expression uneasy. Miss Carmichael, there's someone here to see you. A reporter. Barron's face drained of color. Miss Carmichael's heart pounded in her chest as she exchanged a look with him. Stay here, she ordered, her voice sharper than she intended. She stepped out of the office, her mind racing as she approached the shelter's entrance. Standing just inside the doorway was a woman in her mid-30s, a press badge hanging around her neck and a notebook in her hand. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Miss Carmichael. Ms. Carmichael, the reporter began, extending a hand. I'm Lydia Moore with the Daily Chronicle. I was hoping you could answer a few questions about Barron Trump's involvement with Hope Haven. Miss Carmichael forced a calm expression, though her pulse raced. I'm not sure what you mean. Lydia's lips curved into a faint smile. I think you do. He's been seen here multiple times over the past few weeks. There's also a substantial donation tied to his name. People are curious, and I'd like to get your side of the story before it goes public. Behind her, Barron stepped into the room, his face set with quiet determination. You want answers? Talk to me, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling around him. Lydia turned, her eyes lighting up at the sight of him. Mr. Trump, I didn't expect you to come forward so easily. Well, here I am, he replied, his tone cold. But you should know that if you plan to write a hit piece, you'll be doing it at the expense of a lot of innocent people. Lydia raised an eyebrow. Is that a threat? It's a fact, he shot back. The families here have nothing to do with me or my name. If you're going to drag me through the mud, leave them out of it. MS. Carmichael watched the exchange, her heart in her throat. She had no idea how this would end, but one thing was clear. The future of Hope Haven was hanging by a thread, and every word spoken tonight would decide its fate. The air in the shelter was thick with tension the next morning, a sharp contrast to the warmth and celebration of the previous evening. The families staying there had begun to sense that something was amiss, their whispered conversations and furtive glances revealing their unease. Word had spread that Barron Trump had been questioned by a reporter, and though no one knew the full details, the implications hung heavy in the air. Barron sat in Miss Carmichael's office, staring at his hands. He hadn't slept. The weight of his choices bore down on him, and he could feel the cracks forming in the carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for so long. Across from him, Miss Carmichael leaned against her desk, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and fury. She's going to run the story, she said finally, her voice flat. No matter what you told her last night, no matter how much you tried to shield this place, it's happening. Barron nodded, his jaw tightening. I know, but I meant what I said. This isn't about the shelter. It's about me. Miss Carmichael let out a bitter laugh. You don't get it, do you? This shelter is tied to you now. Your name is on that donation. Your face is the one they'll plaster all over the headlines. And when the media starts tearing you apart, this place will go down with you. I'll go public, he said, his voice low but resolute. I'll admit everything. The money, where it came from, my reasons for giving it. I'll take full responsibility. And what happens when the donors pull out? When the board gets spooked? When families stop coming here because they think we're corrupt? Her voice cracked, and she turned away, running a hand through her hair. You think taking responsibility will fix this, but it won't. The damage is already done. Barron's chest tightened. He had never felt so helpless. Every move he made seemed to lead to another misstep, another consequence he couldn't control. All he had wanted was to do something good, to make up for the things his family name had come to represent. But now, it seemed, he had only made things worse. The article hit the newsstands the following morning, and it was exactly as Ms. Carmichael had feared. The headline screamed across the front page, Barron Trump's secret donation, dirty money for charity? Beneath it was a photograph of Barron leaving the shelter, his face half hidden by the collar of his coat, and a subhead detailing the alleged origins of the donation. The story spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the piece, dissecting every detail, speculating on Barron's motives, and questioning the legitimacy of the shelter's acceptance of the funds. Pundits debated the ethics of the situation on cable news, while social media erupted with outrage and mockery. Some defended Barron's intentions, arguing that he was trying to break free from his family's shadow. Others condemned him as a privileged opportunist trying to launder his image through philanthropy. For the shelter, the fallout was immediate. Donations slowed to a trickle, and some regular contributors withdrew their support entirely. A major donor who had been in talks to fund a new program abruptly canceled their pledge, citing concerns about the shelter's reputation. The board convened an emergency meeting, and though Ms. Carmichael fought fiercely to defend the shelter's integrity, the tension in the room was palpable. "What were you thinking, accepting that kind of money without vetting it?" one board member demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. "I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where it came from." "Well, now everyone knows," another member snapped. "And we're the ones paying the price." Barron retreated from the public eye in the days that followed, his phone inundated with calls from reporters, lawyers, and family members. His father's voice boomed over the line during one particularly heated conversation, demanding to know what he had been thinking. "This is a disaster," Donald fumed. "Do you have any idea how this makes us look? You've dragged the Trump name through the mud again." "I didn't do this for the family," Barron shot back, his voice cold. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." "The right thing?" Donald scoffed. "Do you think the world cares about your intentions? All they see is another scandal. And now, you've got a charity caught in the crossfire." Barron ended the call without another word, the weight of his father's words settling heavily on his shoulders. He had always known that stepping away from the Trump legacy would come with challenges, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly his actions would spiral out of control. For the first time in his life, he felt truly untethered, adrift in a world that seemed determined to twist every good intention into something sinister. Ms. Carmichael, meanwhile, struggled to hold the shelter together. Families continued to rely on Hope Haven, but the strain was evident in every corner of the building. The staff was demoralized, the volunteers wary, and the children confused by the sudden tension that had replaced the usual sense of safety and stability. One evening, as she sat alone in the office, reviewing the shelter's dwindling finances, there was a knock at the door. She looked up to see Barron standing in the doorway, his expression heavy with guilt. "I know I'm the last person you want to see right now," he said quietly, "but I needed to come." She gestured for him to sit, though her posture remained stiff. "What do you want, Barron?" "To make it right," he said simply. "I know I can't undo the damage I've done, but I want to help fix it." She let out a tired sigh, leaning back in her chair. "And how do you propose to do that? Another check? More promises?" "No," he said firmly. "I've already spoken to my lawyers. I'm setting up a trust for the shelter, completely separate from my family's money. It'll take time to rebuild the trust people had in this place, but I'll do whatever it takes." Her eyes softened, though her wariness remained. "Why? After everything, why are you still trying?" "Because this place matters," he said, his voice steady. "The work you do here, it's real, it's good, and I won't let my mistakes ruin that." For the first time since the scandal broke, Miss Carmichael saw a glimmer of sincerity in his eyes, a determination that went beyond guilt or obligation. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Barron stayed true to his word. The trust was established, and though it would take time for the shelter's reputation to recover, the steady support it provided helped stabilize the organization. Barron worked behind the scenes, meeting with donors and community leaders to rebuild their confidence in Hope Haven. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. For Ms. Carmichael, the experience left scars that would take longer to heal. She had always prided herself on her ability to navigate challenges, but the events of the past month had shaken her to her core. Yet, amidst the pain and betrayal, there was a quiet resolve, a determination to protect the shelter and the families who relied on it, no matter what. As for Barron, the scandal marked a turning point in his life. He stepped away from the shadow of his family, determined to forge his own path. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. one rooted not in legacy or obligation, but in the simple act of doing good. The scandal that had erupted around Hope Haven slowly began to fade from the headlines, replaced by newer, more salacious stories. For the shelter, however, the impact lingered like a bruise, visible, tender, and slow to heal. Miss Carmichael, exhausted but resolute, worked tirelessly to restore the organization's reputation. The trust fund Barron had established provided a lifeline, ensuring that no family was turned away, even during the storm of public scrutiny. In the months that followed, life at the shelter returned to a semblance of normalcy. The dining hall was once again filled with laughter and chatter. The volunteers found their rhythm, and the children resumed their games in the small courtyard. But the experience had left an indelible mark on everyone involved. Barron's life, too, had changed irrevocably. He kept his promise to stay out of the spotlight, retreating from public life to focus on personal growth and quiet advocacy. He enrolled in a series of business ethics courses, determined to educate himself on the very systems that had led to his family's wealth and the harm it had caused. Though he knew he would always be judged by the name he bore, he was slowly carving out a new identity, one defined by his actions rather than his lineage. One rainy afternoon, Barron returned to the shelter unannounced. Miss Carmichael found him standing in the lobby, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, looking out at the children playing in the courtyard. "You're a hard man to track down," she said, her tone light but her eyes watchful. He turned, offering a faint smile. "I thought I'd give everyone a break from the drama." She nodded, crossing her arms. "What brings you back?" "I wanted to see how things were going," he said simply, "and to say thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me," he said, his voice tinged with genuine gratitude. "You had every reason to shut the door in my face, but you didn't. You gave me a chance to do something meaningful, even when I screwed it up." Miss Carmichael studied him for a moment, then softened. "You made mistakes, Barron, big ones, but I think you've learned from them. And that's more than a lot of people can say." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of rain pattering against the windows filling the space. "You know," she said finally, "this shelter has always been about second chances. For the families who come here, for the volunteers who find purpose here. Maybe it's fitting that it became that for you too." The story of Hope Haven and Barron Trump lingered in the public consciousness, serving as a cautionary tale about power, privilege, and redemption. For some, it was a stark reminder of the corrupting influence of wealth and the fragility of trust. For others, it was a testament to the capacity for change, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. The media circus that had once surrounded Barron's donation gave way to a more nuanced conversation about the ethics of philanthropy. Was it possible to separate a donor's intentions from the origins of their wealth? Could good deeds ever truly absolve wrongdoing? These questions sparked debates in classrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms alike, challenging people to confront their own assumptions about morality and justice. For Ms. Carmichael, the experience reinforced her belief in the resilience of community. The shelter had weathered the storm not because of any one person, but because of the collective effort of those who believed in its mission. The families who called Hope Haven home, the volunteers who showed up day after day, the donors who stood by them despite the controversy. They were the true backbone of the shelter. And for Barron, the journey was far from over. He knew that his past would always follow him, that his name would always carry a weight he couldn't fully escape. But he also knew that he had the power to define what that name stood for in the years to come. One evening, as he walked through the quiet streets of the city, he passed a newsstand displaying a faded headline from months ago, "Barron Trump's Scandal Rocks Charity World." He paused for a moment, then kept walking, his stride steady and his gaze forward. It wasn't the headline that mattered, he realized, but the story that came after. The story of rebuilding, of resilience, of choosing to do better even when the odds were stacked against him. And in that, he found a quiet sense of peace. Not the peace of absolution, but the peace of knowing he was moving in the right direction, one step at a time.